The year was 2006, and Professor Samuel Friedman of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism had tasked us with writing an essay about an ethics quandary we'd faced as journalists. He wanted us to detail the circumstances, explicate the ethics concerns that confronted us, articulate the primary questions we posed ourselves about it, and how we addressed them, and how the problem was ultimately resolved. The first memory that came to mind was a piano recital given by Jonathan Biss in Chicago's Orchestra Hall in March 2006, and how I struggled to compose a review despite unsettling coincidences and the powerful emotions the project evoked. I was composing a critique of pianist Jonathan Biss's recital that I attended that afternoon in Chicago's historic Orchestra Hall. The pressure to complete it was on as my harried, overworked editor at the Chicago Weekly, one of the University of Chicago's campus newspapers, was expecting the piece by 5 a.m., not a minute later. Ironically, the onset of spring break caused its publication to be delayed until March 30. In most instances, when putting together a performance retrospective, I have been able to completely seclude myself immediately after each performance in order to ponder the recital, concert, or opera performance in question. In the aggregate, I have a bevy of commentaries about which I am at peace because I produce them with clarity of mind and without direct input from others. Or at least that's what I would like to believe, anyway. The Biss piece was not to be a routine exercise for me, however. For one thing, I attended the recital with two friends who are world-class musicians in their own rights. This was unusual for a number of reasons. I had not in recent memory attended a recital with an accomplished hornist, or with a world-class pianist, for that matter. That the pianist was with us was odd, given that they rarely go to other pianists' performances unless it is to see a friend or a world-renowned titan, which Biss was not, or to hear aspiring younger artists in competitions. No matter, my loquacious friends were brimming with commentary throughout the afternoon. But there was something else. In all my years of writing about classical pianists, I have never been privy to as scorching an array of commentaries about an artist immediately before writing a review as I had this extraordinary evening. Mind you, it's generally easy to see and feel what an audience thinks about a pianist. That part is artless. I often overhear telling comments about her or him during intermission, if not before. These are generally snippets of discreet conversations, especially if there are reservations about what has happened on stage. But such in-the-wind comments are part and parcel of the concert-going experience, although they can and do influence the critic's reference frame. In this instance, I had just returned from a splendid dinner party attended by scores of guests. About half a dozen of them had attended Biss's recital, one of which I had been acquainted with prior to that evening. And as far as I could discern, most everyone at the shindig freely partook of rare vintage libations that were continuously served up by urbane, slickly coiffed waiters. Consequently, we were treated, or better yet, subjected each other to garrulousness of remarkable order. Many guests said much that was probably better left unsaid. Similarly, those who had attended Biss's recital were not at a loss for words either. This is what happens at such parties. But since this particular crowd was mostly unfamiliar to me, I was happy to nurse approximately one full glass of elderberry wine per hour so as to mind properly my P's and Q's. Besides, the food was scrumptious. I would have been remiss not to participate fully in this uncommon feast. By this time, I already had much of what I was going to say about Biss in my head or scribbled in my journalist's mini pad, since the pianist had unwittingly made my job less knotty for a number of reasons, but I could not resist eavesdropping on what other guests had to say about his performance. As it turned out, they actually had a lot more to say about him rather than his playing, some of it controversial and unfamiliar. They brandished their issues with Biss absent any apparent trepidation whatsoever, at which point I realized I had been caught off guard. Here I sat listening to colorful commentaries about my subject. What to do? I quietly resolved not to tell them that I was writing a review. That was the least I could do, I thought. I didn't want to leave the party, however. They said that Biss was not as talented as he was touted to be, that his career had been propped by his highbrow legacy, that some critics, not this one, and assorted record executives were friends of the Biss family. I learned that his mother is the distinguished violinist Miriam Fried, whose artistry I hold in high regard. His parental grandfather was the magnificent cellist Rava Garbusova, a close friend of composer Samuel Barber, who wrote his famous cello concerto for her. I found out that Biss's father, Paul, is a respected violin teacher at Indiana University, a classical powerhouse by any standard. While I knew the Fried and Garbusova stories, that of Biss's father, Paul, was fresh data. This newfound erudition resurrected what are normally dormant, though angry thoughts that lurk in my mind's recesses. As one who has worked in the college admission business for several years, I witnessed some admit decisions made at Harvard, Cornell, and even at Chicago that were not merit-based necessarily. Indeed, the vast wealth of some legacy applicants was the critical factor in their being admitted. I recalled the outrage I felt and continue to feel about these decisions, especially given the scorn that was sometimes heaped upon non-white applicants whose qualifications exceeded those of the legacies, which more often than not elicited unfettered awe from some of my untouched colleagues. To add insult to injury, some of these legacy families comprise individuals who rail fervidly and publicly against diversity and the admission of so-called unqualified minorities. These misguided trumpets can be utterly shameless and laughably pseudo-intellectual in their assertions, often conveniently eschewing the overwhelming evidence that as most selective schools have become more diverse, so too have risen their admissions standards. After I left the party, I felt haunted by the question about telling my readers of Biss's legacy. I reasoned that in so doing, people would conclude that his disappointing performance was linked to a buttressing of sorts. I decided that the legacy story was not germane to what I needed to say. I thought that if his career does nosedive because he is insufficiently talented, it would eventually happen without my help, just as with the careers of borderline quality legacies who fail to meet expectations because they sport certain credentials. I reminded myself this was not a feature story. It was a review, simply or not so. Setting aside the legacy issue and my feelings therein, I could not overlook what I shared with Biss. 3 of the works in his program I knew intimately because I had performed them myself. Robert Schumann's Fantasy in C major, one of the most romantic works in the literature, and 2 of Beethoven's sonatas, the Pathétique and the 30th in E major. The Fantasy had been a centerpiece of my own repertoire when I had planned to enter an international competition in a distant time and place. The Pathétique I had played in my boyhood recitals, and the E major sonata I had performed successfully in my admissions audition at Biss's alma mater, Philadelphia's Curtis Institute. I owned several recordings and had seen numerous performances of these pieces, the quality of which had spanned the gamut. I also harbored well-cultivated ideas about how one might approach executing each of these pieces, right down to specifics about their most poignant passages and vexing technical challenges. Many of the above internal conflicts with which I grasped were painful, in part because they recalled some of the most difficult moments of my life. A crippling condition of stage fright that erupted in my late teens had forced me to forego a career as pianist. Surely I was still angry and grieving about that, it seemed to me. Would Biss's eerily evocative program work against him as I wrote about his performance? I told myself that the aforementioned coincidences should not have a negative bearing on my review, that such thoughts were silly and uncalled for. Then there was my own history with the Curtis Institute, who did not admit me ultimately. I wonder how I might have fared there had I been admitted, studying with the likes of Mstislaw Horozowski, Rudolf Serkin, who, in yet another coincidence, is the father of pianist Peter, who I have always regarded as a peer pianist, even though he is much older, and Jorge Bolet, 3 artists I had admired so as a wide-eyed little boy. I can still recall with crystalline lucidity the first time when, as a stunned 11-year-old, I saw the elder Serkin give an all-Beethoven recital in Akron, Ohio, in what was an embarrassingly bleak, starkly cavernous armory in the dead of winter. His take that evening on another one of Beethoven's sonatas, the notorious Appassionata, which I subsequently learned and performed in secondary school, had made an indelible impression on me. As such, I felt resentment toward Biss as I asked and responded to an irrelevant question. Would Serkin and Bolet have admitted Biss? Surely not. Times certainly have changed. Here, I struggled with what journalism professor Ronald Smith refers to as the social responsibility of journalists in his book, Groping for Ethics in Journalism, although I prefer to think of it as the journalist's fiduciary. My duty here was to cast about my feelings, setting aside the ones I believed unfairly affected my views about Biss. My calling was to report to my highly discerning, relentlessly discriminating constituency the truth about the fact of Biss's performance. I needed to be accountable for Biss's sake as well as my own. The words of University of Minnesota journalist Jeremy Eggers comes to mind at this juncture. There is a continuing tension between an understanding of the concept of truth that equates truth and facticity and conceptions of truth that seek larger truths or the big picture. While I cannot claim to have deliberated in such eloquent terms, I did realize that my charge was to be honest with myself and with my public. That Biss approached the repertoire in ways that varied noticeably with mine challenged me to look to Eggers' larger truth about Biss's playing. Did his reading have integrity? Did it evince a comprehensive consistency in its unfurling? Was it sensible? By this point, the fact that Biss's readings of the works differed from mine had now morphed into a blessing, as far as I could tell, since the process enabled me a glimpse at his intellectual bent. I yearned to understand what he was communicating. I grappled with his undergirding sentiments. I pressed hard to glean what inspired Biss as a musician. These were the elements that must invigorate my commentary, I told myself. This was hard work. There are other pretty heady, some would say surreal considerations that consistently plague music critics that I could mention here, at least in passing, to give fuller girth to this very personal expose. The tension between the music's translation by an artist, that is to say, understanding the overarching goal of the artist and her or his success at having realized it, versus a more rhetorical reading, whereby the artist subsumes a manifestly idiosyncratic conceptualization in favor of promoting the original idea of a work as composer meant it to be. This is roughly akin to being a perfect witness in legal and journalistic worlds, which has its risks, as does the translational approach. Some great composers have acknowledged there can be greater interpretations of their musical ideas than their own, and surprisingly, they sometimes favor another reading of their work to their own. A famous example of this occurred with the Russian composer-pianist Sergei Rachmaninoff, whose sheer pianistic powers are considered by many to have been matched, if at all, only by the likes of Mr. Beethoven, Franz Liszt, Clara Schumann, Joseph Hoffmann, Horowitz, Argerich, etc. These men and women are considered the greatest pianists of their eras because they demonstrated what is known as the grand style of performance. That is to say, that common vector to their unique interpretive genius that transcends the instrument and finds repose in their quasi-metaphysical readings of great music. Rachmaninoff was captivated by piano titan Bino Moiseevich's grand style, whose interpretation of Rachmaninoff moved the composer to say that Moiseevich's readings were superior to his own. He called the man his spiritual heir. They enjoyed a wonderful friendship. Thus, in order to achieve a genuine musical understanding, one must evolve an esoteric, analytic strategy, a spiritual state of mind for which each artist and every critic must reach deep into her or his soul to cultivate. This goes to apprehending what is in the music and what is not. It is precisely this point that enabled me to nurture a clearer vision of Biss as pianist. I was able to transmogrify a potential liability, that is, my intimate association with the music, into a resource of inspiration as I listened, watched, and thought about how Biss expressed himself through the music. In the words of our legendary Russian pianist Moseyevich, no sincerely planned and logically motivated interpretation is wholly wrong. Biss had plenty of breathing room here, since his were not rhetorical readings, as might be discerned in the exquisite pianism of Alfred Brendel or William Kempf, for examples. Focusing on Biss's interpretations helped me set aside questions about his legacy. I reminded myself that his family was not here with him performing chamber music works. It was the younger Biss, alone, who took to this venerable stage, presumably of his own free will. And he bore full responsibility for the music that he shared with us and the consequences therein. Once I had at last groped my way past the legacy issue, my angry feelings about legacies receded into the night, and a potential harm to Biss had vaporized. I was able to hone in on what I had seen and heard at the concert hall. In the end, the Society of Professional Journalists' basic principles to seek truth and report it, to minimize harm, to act independently, and to be accountable, saw me through this night as I generated my review. Nevertheless, I would not be entirely truthful if I did not admit that Biss's poor performance and mediocre performance of said pieces helped steer me clear of the venomous intellectual and sentimental barbs that threatened to infect my work. Biss had hoisted himself by his own petard, and I had at last completed my job in dignified fashion. One of the strategies that I like to employ when writing reviews is quoting someone in the audience. On this fine day, I quoted my aforementioned pianist friend in the review's penultimate paragraph, only for my editor to misattribute it to, after the recital, a master pianist friend of Biss who was in the audience, instead of what I had originally submitted, which was a comment made by a friend of mine. This was irritating, especially to my pianist friend, but at least my editor got what my friend actually said right, which was, he remarked that in the fantasy, Biss's instincts were clearly in the right direction. The problem was that he never got to where he wanted to go. My friend's comment went, of course, to the translational interpretation for which Biss had desperately striven and missed. Several weeks later, another friend of mine in San Francisco and I were chatting when Biss's name came up. He told me that Biss had played to poor reviews on the West Coast. I did some digging and saw that some high-flying critics had been much tougher on Biss than I. Had I overcompensated for fear of not acting independently, or concern about my anger taking me to an inappropriate space? I don't think so. Both of my trusted, tried and true friends who sat with me through the recital asserted that my review was, quote, spot on, unquote. That was plenty good enough for me.